Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. Today we will have a close encounter with reality. And I'm not talking about some Chinese balloon floating above Montana. It's a close encounter with reality that apparently we are really not supposed to have, at least according to those who are woke and those who are in the know. It has to do with a young woman by the name of Chloe Cole, who was in town and spoke a couple of nights. Actually, she spoke Wednesday night and Thursday in Boise. She spoke at Capital Clarity, sponsored by the Idaho Freedom Foundation, and by all accounts is just a wonderful, passionate spokesperson for her cause, which is helping youth who are struggling with gender identity issues. Now, Chloe herself was suffering from gender dysphoria, and I believe at about age 12, she just decided, I want to be a boy. And she immediately was put on to, when she went to the doctor pretty much said, oh, well, you have no choice. This is what we need to do. They put her on hormone blockers. They actually performed a double mastectomy on her when she was about 15. And then she reached a point where she realized, this isn't really what I want. This isn't really me. So, whoops, now what do you do? Well, Chloe courageously is coming forward and speaking out on behalf of other young people who are struggling with these issues. And this is not to in any way denigrate those who struggle with these issues. Everybody has something that they struggle with. Gender dysphoria, I believe, is a real disorder, much like anorexia is a real disorder in which someone sees themselves very differently than what actually comports with reality. Chloe's experience, of course, brought out some interest from members of the community who are very concerned about the ongoing push to really push this on children. You really shouldn't be questioning your identity. And, if there's anything we can do to help you transition, why there's a multi-billion-dollar healthcare industry that's standing by and growing as we speak to help them with what they're calling gender-affirming care. I guess that would explain why we see headlines like this one from KTVB. Idaho bill to ban gender-affirming care for minors is met with opposing perspectives. Now, gender-affirming care is a really nice, soft euphemism for surgical mutilation involving removing the sex organs or altering the sex organs of minors. And it's crazy that this is even something being debated, but such is the crazy upside-down world that we live in at this time. Now, I got to give credit to Brian Holmes from KTVB, is known for his accomplished sophistry, and I actually have to admit, the guy was fairly even-handed in this article, but you'll see there's a defense that he offers for this so-called gender-affirming surgery, which is sexual mutilation of minors. We'll get to that in just a few moments. So the story starts out by informing us Idaho Representative Bruce Skog proposed a bill in the Judiciary Rules and Administration Committee on January 31st to ban gender affirmation treatment for people under 18 years old. Now, again, gender affirmation treatment is a warm, fluffy, nice way of saying surgery, surgical removal of parts of their bodies. And it can include hormone blocking too, even though that's not as permanent. When you start introducing, puberty blockers and so forth, you are talking about switching off the body's hormonal system. And just to put this into perspective, how powerful are our hormones? Powerful enough that a single dropped into an Olympic-sized swimming pool can affect the entire body. That's the analogy that I've heard used. Hormones are extremely powerful. I still think we're learning the extent to which they regulate and affect us in our lives. So to pretend like it's just an on-off switch, well, okay, now you're a girl, now you're a boy. It's not that easy. And Representative Skog's bill includes puberty blockers, hormone treatments, gender affirmation surgery, which again, this is surgical removal of body parts. All would be punishable by felony for anyone supplying such treatments to minors. Now, this is a really interesting distinction, and it's an essential distinction. Once they reach the age where they are old enough to enter into contracts, that would be 18, it's their choice. And it would not stop them from making that choice. But before reaching that age, this would prohibit it and would actually punishment, according to Representative Skog. Now, anyone found guilty of such a felony, if the bill were to become law, would face up to 10 years in prison, according to the bill. Representative Skog proposed a similar bill during the 2022 legislative session that aimed to make the proposed crime punishable up to life in prison. That bill died in the Senate. Representative Skog said, "I will say children in Idaho are suffering from these procedures, so-called therapies, having healthy body parts removed. Sometimes that involves a girl of 15 having double mastectomy for sex change purposes." Now that's pretty serious stuff. Now, here's where Brian kind of spins it in favor of, well, be that as it may, there's an opposing perspective. And here we try to justify it with the idea that, well, but sometimes it's a positive thing. LGBTQ plus youth have consistently had a greater risk for depression and suicide. I'd like to understand, why exactly is that? Is it because, nobody's accepting them? Because that's not exactly true. You look at most of pop culture, you look at most of the major corporations, basically you look at most of the institutions in this country. They're not just accepting, they're like affirming. So to say that, well, nobody's accepting me and that's leading to depression and suicide, I think it must be something else. And just floating the possibility, could it be because there is conflict? They understand. They're telling people, accept me for what I am, when they can't accept themselves for what they are. According to the Trevor Project, a national nonprofit which says its mission is to end suicide among lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning young people, the project estimates that over 9,000 LGBTQ plus youth seriously consider suicide annually. I don't doubt them on that number. Additionally, the National Institute of Health compiled 27 studies and found of the nearly 8,000 patients who did have gender-affirming surgeries, both male and female, 77 had regrets. Now, that seems like a remarkably tiny number, right? I mean, that seems like so minor that, in fact, maybe this really is the answer. We'll talk more about that, though. I'd be curious, of the 27 studies that they studied, I'm curious if they included a 30-year study conducted by doctors in Sweden, which, by the way, was leading out when it came to sex reassignment surgery, because their findings were very, very different. Moving on, in the story, in support of Representative Skog's bill, detransitioned Speaker Chloe Cole accepted an invitation from, here's a little snark from Brian Holmes, the Idaho Freedom Foundation, a self-described conservative think tank. That's judgment. That's your first indication that, yeah, there's some editorializing going on here, but thanks, Brian. To speak Thursday at the Idaho State House. Now, Cole said gender dysphoria really is a mental health issue. Yet we're treating it with surgeries and physical interventions. There's not a single other mental health condition that we do the same with. Yet it's perfectly fine for children who wrongly feel they are the opposite sex to be mutilated and castrated. Scary stuff. Cole started on puberty blockers at age 13, had a mastectomy by the time she was 15. She said she attributes a large part of her transition to the encouragement she received online. By the age of 16, after her surgery, Cole began to doubt her transition. She told the State House audience she called the transition a mistake. I found out that I was being lied to, not only by my doctors, but also by this community. Now, that raises a really interesting question. Why would someone promote something like this? Why would someone affirm something like this? In whose interest is it? Is it really looking out for the person who is struggling with gender dysphoria? Or is there another motive? I mean, is it for some? And I'm questioning the motives, but I'm also wondering seriously, is it just a matter of, I want to appear more empathetic or more inclusive or more woke than somebody else? I don't know the answer, but I do think that encouraging someone to embrace their gender dysphoria and to take permanent steps that cannot be reversed or cannot easily be reversed in the case of hormone therapy, I'm not sure that that's doing the right thing. I totally understand that, these are at-risk youth, and I think it's a serious disorder that requires help and compassion, not condemnation or ridicule. But to tell them that, well, we need to embrace this and we need to just charge headlong into it would be like telling an anorexic, you're right, you do need to lose another 10 pounds. Both have a very distorted view that is apart from reality as to who or what they are. And that's something that's taking place in their mind. It's not healthy. In the same way you wouldn't tell an anorexic, yeah, you probably should, go on a diet, or you should, take some more laxatives or whatever to lose that extra weight. That would be akin to encouraging them to kill themselves. All right, back to the story. Under Skogg's bill, this is referring to another child, a young man who transitioned, actually a boy who transitioned into a girl who now goes by Lynn and lives as a female. Lynn would not be able, under Skogg's bill, to receive her puberty blockers or hormone treatment until Lynn is 18 years of age. It would be a major step backward for her mental health and well-being, according to the family. Lynn said, "I would be very depressed at best. I don't want to worry about bills forcing me to leave my state. I'm not prepared for what happens after that." Well, now, I hate to point this out, but you do have the option, of course, of it's just like with the abortion issue. Idaho has taken a stand as a state. The citizens of Idaho support limiting abortion to only the most extreme circumstances. It's not a matter of convenience. If someone wants an abortion, they can absolutely go to a neighboring state and get what they want. Likewise, if someone is looking for gender-affirming care, pretty good bet you're going to find it in a neighboring state. But I think it's absolutely reasonable that the citizens of this state do not condone whatever this agenda is that's pushing this gender confusion and gender questioning, and actually, the gender bending that's taking place. This is from an article from the heritage.org, from the Heritage Foundation. This was from actually back in 2018. And it says, when the tumult and shouting dies, it proves not easy or wise to live in counterfeit sexual garb. Now, this is talking about transitioning sexual reassignment surgery. The most thorough follow-up of sex reassigned people extending over 30 years and conducted in Sweden, where the culture is strongly supportive of the transgendered, documents their lifelong mental unrest. You understand that? It doesn't cure the problem. Not for everybody, maybe for some. But 10 to 15 years after surgical reassignment, the suicide rate of those who had undergone sex reassignment surgery rose to 20 times that of comparable peers. In fact, here is a quote from the actual study itself. Persons with transsexualism after sex reassignment have considerably higher risks for mortality, suicidal behavior, and psychiatric morbidity than the general population. Our findings suggest that sex reassignment, although alleviating gender dysphoria, may not suffice as treatment for transsexualism and should inspire improved psychiatric and somatic care after sex reassignment for this patient group. Okay, so that's not turning their backs on these patients. It's not, trying to insist that, it's all in your head, just, stop trying to feel that way. It's actually offering care. But it's taking a more cautious approach and recognizing that even those who undergo the surgery kill themselves at a highly, highly inflated rate compared to their peers. Now, that's not a reason to gloat, like, see, we're right. That's a tragedy. But again, I'm suggesting maybe embracing and furthering a lie isn't the way to go. And yet there are people who question, well, why would anybody even, question when someone says, I don't feel like I'm born in the right body? In fact, here's a good example of it. Check out this tweet. I think most gender critical people genuinely enjoy trans people suffering. I think it's a large part of the motivation. I'm not a psychologist, but that might just fit under psychological projection. I don't know of anybody who enjoys seeing other people suffer. But I like the response that was given to that tweet. When make-believe crosses the line into delusion, encouraging it is not compassionate. It's cruel. It's not kind to encourage someone else's delusion just to satisfy your own desire to be woke. That may seem like a harsh truth, but I think it's a truth nonetheless. And the crazy thing about it is, this is such a controversial thing today. I'm going to share with you a video from possibly the least controversial person of my childhood and growing up. I can't think of anybody less controversial than Mr. Rogers, but can you imagine the outrage if Mr. Rogers were to say today what he said just not so many years ago?
Boys are boys from the beginning. If you were born a boy, you stay a boy. Girls are girls right from the start. If you were born a girl, you stay a girl and grow up to be a lady. Only girls can be the mommies. Only boys can be the daddies.
I know that's a triggering video for some people. There are people who would lose their minds overhearing even the kindest guy in the neighborhood, Mr. Rogers, affirming something that should be self-evident to us. Now, again, this is not to rub salt in the wounds of those people who have gender dysphoria and have legitimate confusion as to who they are. But the bottom line is, and I'm sorry if this is just too blunt and just too cruel for some, but your DNA has not changed. Your chromosomal makeup has not changed, regardless of what surgery, what hormone replacement therapy you may have had. And years from now, should an archaeologist uncover a transgendered person's bones, they're going to make a judgment based on, well, that's a male skeleton or that's a female skeleton. Okay, this isn't to be cruel. This is a close encounter with reality. That freaks out some people for some reason, but we live in a time where reality is being inverted, and we're not supposed to acknowledge these things. That's considered extremely impolite. And so we find an alternative reality trying to force its way into our consciousness, or more appropriately, force its way into our children's consciousness. Case in point, Idaho School Boards Association upholds its LGBTQ plus model policy in response to Labrador's questioning. I mean, it makes it sound like the Attorney General is being terribly unreasonable for questioning this. This is from Idaho Press from yesterday. The executive director of the Idaho School Boards Association responded on Monday to a critical letter Idaho Attorney General Raul Labrador sent last week, admonishing the organization for its role in developing model policies, especially an LGBTQ plus rights policy. By the way, rights are not invented by government. You either have them or you don't, but that's probably a story for another time, for school districts and charters. Labrador's letter came a few days after he questioned the legality of the LGBTQ plus policy on Twitter. In response, Misty Swanson, executive director of the Idaho School Boards Association, upheld the nonprofit's role of helping school board members carry out their school governance role in ever-changing environments, including its model policy services. So I have to ask the question, why are these environments ever changing? Is it because of newly discovered evidence, or is it because someone has an agenda to inject as much rainbow-colored, ideology as possible into the school systems? Because I'm much more inclined to come down on that position than to think that, oh, well, we just discovered all these things and that therefore we need to take care of it. Actually, listen to what Swanson wrote. She says, "We have maintained that our job is to provide schools with a framework on sensitive topics that navigates the layers of legal complexities." In other words, the artificial rules to avoid costly litigation, intense investigations from the U.S. Department or Office for Civil Rights, or the loss of federal funding. Couple lessons you can learn from this. Number one, legal complexities typically come down to artificial rules or bureaucracy, which will always be pushed to the point of absurdity. That's just the general rule of bureaucracy. But nobody's going to lose their job over it. It's just, that's what bureaucracies do. Secondly, this illustrates the danger in taking federal funding. Oh, I know there are those, but we couldn't survive. We couldn't get by without federal funding. Yet look at the strings that are attached. And in this case, the threat. Why, there might be, litigation. There might be intense investigation. They might withhold our funding. So you're going to dance like a puppet to whatever tune is being called. Now, the letter of correspondence was sparked by a recent uproar over an LGBT plus rights policy, the form of which has been adopted at about 60 Idaho school districts and charters. And this is pure spin that protects students from discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation. No, what it does is it tries to codify that particular ideology in the name of protecting them from discrimination. And it does so by creating discrimination against everyone else. In other words, it speaks to the exception rather than the rule. I know this is a hard thing to believe, but there was a time when people kept certain things to themselves. Yeah, like what goes on in your bedroom, your preferences. Those weren't things that you went around wearing as, this is my identity. This is on my shirt sleeve. Everybody can see this is who I am. If you are that single-faceted of an individual, I feel sorry for you. We're much more multifaceted. And in this case, the claim of, well, this is who I am. No. Sexual identity really comes down to what you do. It's about behavior. And it just seems like there's a very powerful effort to try to introduce deviancy in the name of inclusivity into the minds of young people, as young and as vehemently as possible. So it's not about just protecting people from discrimination. It's about creating special classes of people. This is typical leftist, class warfare and identity politics. Why is it finding its way into our schools? The threat of, well, the federal government might do something about it. That shouldn't be enough. Whose schools are they? Who are they supposed to serve? Do they serve the students and the parents who send their kids to these schools, or do they serve the federal government? That's a question that needs to be asked. Now, I do have to give credit, at least this article from Idaho Press does note that Swanson sidestepped or provided vague responses to some of the specific questions Labrador listed at the end of his letter. And he was asking some pretty tough questions, but offered to meet in person with Labrador or his staff to further discuss the policy and ISBA's work. I think we saw that before, in I think the transgender Secretary of Health and Human Services, Rachel Levine. Am I remembering the name right? I'm sorry. I really don't immerse myself much in national politics, but when the secretary was being questioned over various policies concerning LGBT and transgender stuff, the answer was, I'm not going to answer this in committee. That's something we should discuss in private. Why can't this be out in public? I mean, why can't this be transparent so that people know what's really going on? I'm sorry if that sounds suspicious, but gosh, I don't want to say the words, but if you don't have anything to hide, why don't you go ahead and talk about it in the open so people can understand really where this is coming from. Now, this leads us to the issue of school choice. And by the way, it looks like there is a school choice bill that is going to be making its way into the legislature at this point. So the alarms are ringing for those who are anti-school choice. Here's an article from the Idaho Capital Sun. Records show powerful, wealthy funders outside Idaho back school choice campaign. In fact, there's a Democratic candidate in eastern Idaho who says the group targeted her race with a misleading mailer. Oh no, that's never happened before in politics. Someone says, well, this person supports higher taxes, more government, less freedom. That's the nature of political ads. But let's talk about some of the specifics here about these wealthy groups that are funding school choice. The national special interest groups who've poured millions of dollars into efforts to make education savings account programs a reality in states like Arizona, Utah, Wyoming, Wisconsin, and New Hampshire are the same donors who spent hundreds of thousands of dollars during Idaho's midterm election to ensure school choice-friendly legislators occupied as many seats as possible in the Idaho legislature. Records show. It's a pretty extensive article, but the dots they're trying to connect here are pretty interesting. The American Federation for Children and the State Policy Network are two of those groups that are coordinated and funded by millionaires and billionaires. The gospel of envy is beginning, dedicated to conservative policy positions across the U.S. and now in Idaho. Senator Tammy Nichols of Middleton introduced an education savings account bill Tuesday for parents to use some, I think they forgot that word, per pupil funding from state funds at the institution of their choice. When I say some, what I mean is the amount that it would provide is somewhere around $6,000, whereas the per pupil funding is somewhere in the neighborhood of $8,000. What happens to that leftover money? Oh, it stays within the system. But see, that wouldn't, that wouldn't generate as much outrage as, well, they're just taking all of our money. So here's the graphic that shows how outside billionaires are pushing school choice in Idaho. Powerful donors, including Betsy DeVos, have poured millions of dollars into a Washington, D.C.-based organization that spent money to influence Idaho's 2022 elections. That money went through a PAC that has Idaho in its name, but appears to have no real ties to Idaho. All right, let's first of all, Dr. Bryant's going to prescribe 500 milligrams of chill pill, stat. If you have never worked within the nonprofit sector, It's really easy to fall into the trap that, oh my gosh, this is that dark money I keep hearing so much about. Dark money. If it's dark, it must be bad. That kind of sounds vaguely racist to me, but that's the term they prefer. It's dark money coming into our state trying to influence things. Okay, I've worked in the nonprofit sector. In fact, as a director of development for a think tank. And you would be amazed at the number of people out there who are engaged in philanthropy. Now, philanthropy can take a lot of different forms, and there are definitely philanthropists who support left-wing causes, just as there are philanthropists who support things that would be considered conservative. For some reason, that's supposed to be suspicious. Only that can be dark money. So when you hear Betsy DeVos and the Koch brothers and others, being listed as well, they're likely the ones that are funding this. Just understand, the concept of school choice is necessary, not just in Idaho, but in other states as well, because there is a leviathan that has been created involving teachers' unions. Which, by the way, the article says nothing about teachers' unions and the money that they spend trying to influence elections. But they're a huge political action group. Why don't we hear anything about that? I don't know. It's a curious oversight. It seems a little bit slanted to me, but okay, let's take it at face value. The bottom line is there are people at every level of income engaged in philanthropy. It could be people like you and me. Maybe we're donating $50 or $100 or $1,000 to a cause that we believe in. There are people who have much more substantial means. Yes, the millionaires and billionaires, which, again, are we supposed to be suspect because, well, they have more money than I do, therefore they must be bad, or they didn't really earn it? Many times, they have nonprofit foundations that are really honestly trying to make a difference. And again, if you haven't ever worked within the nonprofit sector, you wouldn't realize this. But when your job is to actually, find out who are these organizations that would line up with our beliefs and how can we apply for grants or how can we apply for, donations from them, it's a very legitimate thing. And it's completely legal. There's nothing shady about it. The IRS keeps very close tabs. Every year they file their 990 forms that, account for how much money they have given away for various causes. And it works all across the ideological spectrum. So again, I don't understand the hysteria for why, well, this one is conservative or this one is wanting to provide choice, where right now there's very limited choice or no choice. So again, don't get upset. Don't get too wigged out by the idea that, well, gee, there are some people with a lot of money out there trying to make a difference. Believe it or not, that's how people did it. In fact, if you really want to surprise yourself, go back and look at all the things that were accomplished in the United States prior to 1913. Why prior to 1913? Because there was no permanent income tax prior to 1913. Yet hospitals were built, museums were built, bridges were built. How was it done? The answer is philanthropy. So to me, philanthropy is it's a grand tradition that continues today. And the only people who really seem to be threatened by this are the people who, for whatever reason, believe that, they alone have the answer for what our children must be learning. And by the way, it all seems to be pretty woke these days. And anything that offers an alternative or offers an escape from the indoctrination that they wish to see our kids have, well, that's something that just cannot be. At least that seems to be the ones who fight the hardest whenever they have that close encounter with reality. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Hyde is Nowhere to Hide. Thanks again for joining us.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy.